Rain has a sound in this city that people who grew up here learn to read like weather reports. Soft rain means nothing. Hard rain, the kind that hammers tin roofs and drowns out car engines, means something is coming. That night, the rain was hard. Cassia Vance stood in her small kitchen on the third floor of a walk-up building that had seen better decades, folding a basket of laundry that never seemed to get smaller no matter how many times she folded it. Behind her, on the worn sofa under a blanket that had been washed so many times it had gone the color of weak tea, her 7-year-old son Trey slept with his mouth open and one leg hanging off the cushion. The television murmured cartoons at a volume just low enough not to wake him. The apartment smelled like fabric softener and the last of dinner's garlic, and for a moment, just a moment, Cassia let herself believe the day was actually over. She had triple-checked the locks 2 hours ago, the way she did every night. Deadbolt. Chain. The extra slide bolt near the top of the frame that she'd installed herself with a borrowed drill the year Trey was born, because a woman raising a child alone in this neighborhood did not wait for anyone else to make her feel safe. She built that feeling herself, one lock at a time. 3 knocks broke the rhythm of the rain, not the friendly rap of a neighbor borrowing sugar, not the impatient bang of a delivery man, annoyed at climbing 3 flights. These knocks were uneven, spaced wrong, like the hand behind them wasn't entirely steady. Cassia's whole body went still. She glanced at Trey, still asleep, and crossed the room without making a sound, the way she'd trained herself to move in a home with thin walls and a light sleeper. She looked through the peephole first. Then, when the angle didn't tell her enough, she opened the door on the chain. The gap showed her a stranger. He was tall, dressed in a suit that had probably cost more than her monthly rent, now soaked through and clinging to his frame. A dark stain spread across the collar of his white shirt, blooming from a wound at his neck that he hadn't bothered to press a hand against, as if pain were something he'd simply decided not to acknowledge tonight. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. Rain ran down a jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from something harder than skin. But it wasn't his blood that made Cassia's stomach drop. It was the small hand wrapped inside his. A little boy stood beside him, soaked to the bone, maybe 8 years old, staring up at her with the kind of exhausted, glassy stillness that children shouldn't know how to wear. He wasn't crying. He wasn't asking questions. He was simply standing in the rain like he'd learned a long time ago that crying didn't change anything. "Please," the man said, his voice low, controlled, and somehow more frightening for how calm it was. Just for tonight. Just him. Cassia's hand tightened on the door edge. Every rule she'd built her life around told her to shut it. 9 years of living alone with a child had taught her exactly what happened to women who opened doors to bleeding strangers in the middle of the night. "Who's after you?" she asked, keeping her voice flat, unreadable. "Nobody who knows where you live," he said. "Not yet, not yet." 2 words that should have ended the conversation right there. Should have made her slam the door, slide the bolt, and call the number for the precinct 2 blocks over. Instead, her eyes dropped to the boy again, to the way his small fingers were white-knuckled around his father's hand, to the way he hadn't so much as shivered, despite being drenched, like his body had learned that showing discomfort only invited more of it. She thought of Trey. She thought of every time she'd promised herself that if she ever saw a child who needed help, She would not be the adult who looked away. "Get in," she said, already unhooking the chain. "Both of you now." She sat him at the kitchen table, because it was the only surface with good light, and because some part of her, the part that had spent years patching up Trey's scraped knees and busted lips from schoolyard falls, moved before her fear could catch up. She grabbed the first aid kit from under the sink, a dish towel and a bowl of warm water, and got to work on the gash along his neck without asking permission. "This needs stitches," she muttered, dabbing at the wound. "You're lucky it missed anything that matters." "I've had worse," he said, and something about the flatness in his voice told her he meant it literally. Trey woke somewhere in the middle of all this, the way children do, not with a start, but with a slow, blinking awareness that something had changed in the air of the apartment. He sat up on the sofa, rubbed his eyes, and saw the boy standing near the door, dripping onto the linoleum, wrapped in one of Cassia's spare towels. "Leo?" Trey said. The boy, Leo, looked up. For the first time since he'd arrived, something in his face loosened. Not quite a smile, but close. "Trey," Leo said back, like a password exchanged between old friends. Cassia's hands paused on the dish towel. "You two know each other?" "He's in my class," Trey said, already sliding off the sofa and padding over in his socks, entirely unbothered by strangers or blood or the strange electricity in the room. He sat down next to Leo on the floor without hesitation. Leo sat down too. Neither boy said much of anything after that. They didn't need to. Something in both of them recognized something in the other, and that was enough. The man at the table watched his son settle, and for a moment the granite control on his face cracked just slightly. "Adrian Vale," he said, finally, as if remembering his manners belonged to a different life than the one currently bleeding on Cassia's kitchen chair. "My son is Leo, Cassia Vance," she said back, because there didn't seem to be a version of this night where she could pretend she hadn't already let them into her home. "You want to tell me why you knocked on my door, out of every door on this block?" Adrian's jaw worked for a second before he answered. "Leo mentioned you before." "Not by name. He said there was a boy at school whose mother gave him half a sandwich once when he forgot his lunch." He looked toward the two boys on the floor. He talked about it for a week. Said it was the first time in a long time he felt like somebody was looking out for him who didn't have a reason to. Cassia remembered that day. A quiet kid at pickup, standing off to the side, not asking anyone for anything, the way kids do when they've already learned asking gets them nothing. She'd split Trey's sandwich without thinking twice. "I didn't come here randomly," Adrian said, quieter now. "My son felt safe with yours. That's not something I could ignore tonight of all nights." Cassia looked at the two boys, heads bent together over some quiet conversation only 7- and 8-year-olds could understand, and felt the shape of the night settle differently in her chest. This wasn't chance. It was a father who had run out of good options and remembered the one place his son had ever spoken about feeling steady. By 2 in the morning, Trey and Leo were both asleep. Trey in his own bed, Leo curled on a pile of blankets on the floor beside him, because he refused to be more than an arm's length from a boy he'd known for less than a day, but somehow trusted more than most adults in his life. Cassia sat across from Adrian at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee. Neither of them was drinking. "I want the truth," she said. "Not the version you think I can handle. The whole thing." Adrian studied her for a long moment, like a man deciding whether a person was worth being honest with. Something in her stare must have convinced him, because he exhaled and set his hands flat on the table. "I run a business," he said. "The kind that doesn't get written up in the business section. Tonight, my house was hit. I got Leo out through the kitchen before they cleared the perimeter. I didn't have time to think about where to go. I just knew I needed somewhere small enough, ordinary enough, that nobody would think to look." "So what exactly did you bring to my door?" Cassia asked, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you brought a war." "I brought my son," Adrian said, "to the only place I thought might still be too small for them to search." Cassia sat back, arms crossed, feeling the full weight of what she'd let into her home. Every rule she'd built for herself over the past 9 years. No strangers, no dangerous men. Nobody else's problems inside these walls had just been broken in one night, for a boy she barely knew and a father she trusted even less. But there was a child asleep 12 feet away who had looked at her like she was the safest thing he'd seen in longer than he should have had to go without one. "You get one night," she said. "After that, we figure something else out. But nobody comes through that door unless I say so. Understood?" Adrian nodded once, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something like relief moved through his shoulders. Understood. Before sleep finally took the apartment, Cassia stood in her bedroom doorway for a long moment, watching Adrian sit upright in the chair he'd insisted on taking instead of the sofa, his eyes fixed on the front door like it might betray them at any second. She almost told him to rest. She almost told him nothing was coming tonight, that whatever storm had chased him here had surely lost his trail in the dark and the rain. But she didn't, because some instinct told her a man like that didn't know how to rest even when he was allowed to. And it wasn't her place yet to try to teach him. She lay awake a long time herself, listening to the pipes groan and the building settle, running through everything that had happened in the space of a single evening. A stranger, a bleeding stranger, a child in the rain, and somehow, impossibly, she didn't regret opening the door. She regretted a great many things in her life. Men who hadn't stayed, promises that hadn't held, years spent building walls so thick. She sometimes forgot there was a woman underneath all that armor who still wanted softness. But she didn't regret this. Whatever came of it, she'd made the only choice a decent person could have made when a child stood shivering in a downpour. One night became 3 days, the way these things do when the alternative is worse than staying. By the 3rd afternoon, something in the apartment had shifted into an uneasy rhythm. Adrian's wound had scabbed over into something manageable. He'd made a handful of calls on a phone Cassia didn't ask about, his voice dropping into a register she didn't recognize. Clipped, controlled, giving instructions rather than requests. Leo and Trey had built a blanket fort in the living room and declared it a fortress against invisible enemies, a game that felt a little too close to real life for Cassia's comfort, though she said nothing. She was at the window, watching the block the way she always did in the late afternoon, when she saw it. A black SUV parked directly across the street. New, clean in a way that nothing on this block was ever clean, not with the salt trucks and the potholes and the general grime of a neighborhood nobody sent street sweepers to. It hadn't moved in 2 hours. "Adrian," she said, keeping her voice level. "Come look at this." He crossed the room in 3 strides, and went still at her shoulder. His eyes narrowed on the vehicle, like he was reading a language only he understood. "That doesn't belong here," Cassia said. "Nobody around here drives something that clean. It'd get keyed in a week." "No," Adrian said quietly. "It doesn't belong." A second car, older and less obvious, rolled slowly past the block, circling the corner at a pace too careful to be casual. "They found you," Cassia said. "Not yet," Adrian said, jaw tight. "But they're looking in the right neighborhood." He turned to her, and something in his expression had hardened into a promise. "If anything comes through that door, it goes through me first. I need you to trust that." Cassia didn't know what to do with a promise like that, from a man she'd known for 3 days, whose whole life ran on danger she couldn't begin to understand. But some instinct in her, the same one that had opened the door in the first place, told her it wasn't an empty one. It was Leo's backpack that broke everything open. Adrian had been helping the boys get ready for the next school day. A small, strange normalcy neither Cassia nor Adrian had discussed, but both seemed to agree was necessary, because kids needed routine even in the middle of chaos. When he picked up Leo's backpack from beside the door and paused. "Where did you get this?" he asked his son, turning the bag over in his hands. "Uncle Marcus," Leo said, not looking up from the shoe he was tying. "He gave it to me before school started." Said my old one looked beat up. Something crossed Adrian's face that Cassia hadn't seen there before. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of dawning horror, slow and total. He sat down at the table and began tearing at the lining of the bag with steady, deliberate hands, peeling back the fabric along the seam until his fingers found something small and hard tucked into the padding. He held it up between 2 fingers. A tracker no bigger than a coin. The room went very quiet. Even the boys, sensing the shift in the air, stopped what they were doing and watched. "Marcus," Adrian said, the name coming out like it cost him something to say it. 11 years. I trusted that man with everything. He's the one who gave Leo this bag. Which means he's known where you were," Cassia said slowly. "This whole time, every safe house I've used since he gave Leo this bag," Adrian said, voice flat with the particular calm of a man holding himself together by force. "Every one of them, compromised. It wasn't a rival syndicate that found my house. It was someone who's had a key to my life for over a decade." Cassia looked at the small device in his palm and thought of every betrayal she'd witnessed in her own life. On a much smaller scale, the friend who talked behind her back, the man who left when things got hard. None of it was the same as this, and yet somehow it was. "It's never the stranger who gets you," she said quietly. "It's always somebody who had a key to the door." Adrian looked up at her, something raw moving behind his eyes, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say to a truth that clean. That night, after the boys had finally gone quiet under their blankets, Cassia found Adrian sitting on the fire escape outside her bedroom window, staring out at the wet rooftops of the block, a cigarette unlit between his fingers like he'd forgotten he meant to smoke it. She climbed out and sat beside him without asking, because after everything, formalities felt pointless. "You don't smoke," she said. "I don't do a lot of things I used to do," he said. "Haven't since Leo was born." They sat in silence for a while, the rain having thinned to a drizzle that misted more than fell. "Being a single parent," Cassia said eventually, "people think it means you get twice as strong. Nobody tells you it actually means you're twice as scared, all the time, and there's nobody to hand that fear to for even 5 minutes. Adrian turned his head to look at her. "I built an empire," he said, "so my son would never have to want for anything. Money, protection, whatever he needed, I made sure it existed. And the one thing I couldn't buy him, the one thing all of that never gave him, was somewhere safe to be when I wasn't enough." Cassia felt something in her chest tighten at that, an ache of recognition. "I know that feeling better than you'd think." "You stopped being a stranger 3 days ago," Adrian said, quiet, almost like a confession. "I don't know when it happened, but it did." Cassia let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though her voice cracked slightly on the way out. "Guess my doors open wider than I planned." Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. Something had shifted between them, not into romance yet, not into anything either of them could name out loud. Just two exhausted parents recognizing, for the first time in a long while, that they weren't carrying the weight entirely alone. The next morning, Cassia picked up her phone and started making calls. Adrian watched her from the kitchen, brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" "Calling people who actually know this block," she said, already dialing. She didn't call soldiers. She didn't call anyone with a gun. She called Mrs. Alvarez, the woman 2 floors down who sat by her window from sunrise to sunset and knew every car that had ever driven down this street. She called Devon, the teenager who rode his bike up and down the block at all hours and noticed things nobody else did. Strangers in alleys, cars that idled too long. She called Mr. Briggs at the corner store, who knew every regular customer by name and every stranger by the way they didn't belong. She called Auntie May from the ground floor, the woman who'd called an ambulance for half the building at one point or another and never asked too many questions while doing it. Within an hour, 4 corners of the block had eyes on them. Nobody asked for money. Nobody asked for much explanation at all. Cassia had spent 9 years showing up for these people, watching their kids after school, bringing soup when someone was sick, remembering birthdays nobody else remembered, and now, without her ever having planned for a moment like this, all of it was paying her back. Adrian stood in the doorway, watching the calls happen with something like disbelief. "You built a surveillance network in under an hour," he said. "No money, no equipment." "I built a neighborhood," Cassia said simply, setting the phone down. "You don't buy that. You earn it, one Tuesday at a time, for years, and you don't even realize you're building anything until the day you need it." Adrian said nothing, but the look on his face told her he understood, maybe for the first time, that the kind of protection he'd spent his whole life trying to purchase had been sitting 3 floors up this whole time, built out of nothing but years of ordinary kindness. That afternoon, he stood at the window beside her and watched the block transform in ways he'd never seen an entire city block transform, even with a small army under his command. Mrs. Alvarez had dragged a folding chair to her window and sat there with a thermos of coffee, eyes tracking every car that passed like she was reading a book she'd memorized the plot of years ago. Devon looped past on his bike every 15 minutes, never in a pattern predictable enough for anyone watching to notice, texting Cassia's phone updates in a shorthand only the two of them understood. Mr. Briggs had rearranged the display in his store window, so he had a clear, unobstructed view of the street corner, and twice that afternoon Cassia saw him step outside just to sweep the sidewalk. his eyes never once leaving the black SUV that had finally, mercifully, driven off sometime around noon. "They don't even know they're doing anything unusual," Adrian said almost to himself. "It's just Tuesday to them." "It's just Tuesday to them," Cassia agreed. "That's exactly why it works. Nobody suspects a woman watering her plants. Nobody suspects a kid on a bike. You spend your whole life building walls people can see. I spent mine building people nobody thinks to look at twice." Adrian turned that thought over for a long moment, and something in his face, some deeply held certainty about what protection was supposed to look like, quietly rearranged itself. They gave themselves one more quiet evening, before whatever was coming arrived. Cassia cooked, filling the small kitchen with the smell of a stew her own mother used to make, something warm and unfussy that had been passed down through generations of women who didn't have much money but always had enough love to stretch a pot of food across a table. Adrian, to her surprise, offered to contribute something too. A simple pasta dish, he said, one his late wife used to make for Leo on nights when the world outside their door felt too heavy. He fumbled through it at her stove, more awkward with a wooden spoon than she imagined he was, with anything else in his life, and Cassia found herself laughing for the first time in days at the sight of a man who commanded fear in every other part of his life looking utterly lost over a pot of boiling water. They ate at her small table, Trey, Leo, Cassia, and Adrian, and for a little while the weight of everything outside the apartment seemed to lift. The boys laughed at something only the two of them found funny. The easy, unguarded laughter of children who had decided, without either adult's permission, that they were brothers now. "They'll remember each other this way," Cassia said quietly, watching them. "However this ends." Adrian looked at his son laughing, really laughing, head tipped back, unself-conscious, and something in his face cracked open. "I haven't heard that sound since before his mother died," he admitted. "I forgot what it did to me." Cassia didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She understood in that moment that whatever this was between the four of them, it wasn't something either adult had planned, and it wasn't something either of them was in any position to walk away from now. At 11:47 p.m., the power went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout. The entire block went black at once, the hum of refrigerators and televisions dying mid-breath, plunging the apartment into a darkness so complete Cassia could hear her own heartbeat. Adrian was on his feet before she'd even processed what had happened. "They cut the grid," he said. Voice dropped into that low, controlled register she'd learned meant danger. "How long do we have?" she asked, already moving toward the boys' room. "Minutes," Adrian said. "Get them, now." He gripped her arm before she could move past him, his eyes finding hers in the dark. "Do not open this door," he said. "Not for anyone, not even if you hear my voice, unless I say the word we agreed on. Do you understand me?" Cassia nodded, throat tight, and moved. She got the boys into the small interior bathroom, the safest room in the apartment, no windows to the street, and pressed them both into the corner behind the tub, Trey's hand gripping Leo's, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Out in the hallway, she heard the stairwell door bang open. Heavy footsteps, more than one set. Adrian's voice, low and lethal, saying something she couldn't make out, followed by the unmistakable sound of a fight breaking out in close quarters. Grunts, the thud of a body against a wall, the scrape of boots on concrete stairs. Cassia pressed her back against the bathroom door, listening to the sounds of a man she'd known for less than a week fighting to keep whatever was coming from reaching this apartment, and prayed in the specific and desperate way only a mother in danger prays that it would be enough. It wasn't enough. Not entirely. She heard the bathroom window before she saw it, a soft scrape of metal against the fire escape, the particular sound of someone trying to be quiet and failing. Cassia's whole body went cold. Whoever was coming had realized the stairwell wasn't the only way in. She looked at the two boys pressed into the corner, Leo's eyes wide and glassy in the dark, Trey's small hand still locked around his, and something in her shifted from fear into something harder, older, more animal. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet off the small shelf by the bathroom door, the one she used for everything. The one heavy enough that her arm ached, carrying it from the store 9 years ago, and stood in front of the two children just as the window slid open and a man dropped through it into her bathroom. He was big, dressed in dark clothes, and he looked at her, a plus-size woman in a faded nightshirt, standing in a dark bathroom, holding a frying pan like it was a weapon out of a cartoon, and he laughed. That was his first mistake. Cassia didn't think. She didn't calculate angles or weak points the way a trained fighter would have. She swung with everything 9 years of carrying groceries up 3 flights of stairs, hauling a growing boy on her hip and refusing to let her life break her, had built into her arms. The skillet connected with his shoulder hard enough to stagger him, and when he lunged for her, she fought like something cornered and desperate, nothing pretty about it. Nails and elbows and the sheer refusal to be moved from where she stood. He got a hand around her throat at one point, slamming her back against the tile wall, hard enough that white spots bloomed behind her eyes. And for one terrifying second she thought this was how it ended. But her hand found the ceramic vase on the shelf beside her, the one Trey had made her at school out of clay, glazed a lopsided blue, and she brought it down on the man's head with every last ounce of strength she had left. He crumpled to the tile floor and didn't get back up. Cassia stood over him, chest heaving, skillet still gripped in one shaking hand, when the door burst open and Adrian appeared, bloodied and breathing hard, eyes scanning the room in a fraction of a second before landing on her, standing over an unconscious man, 2 children safe in the corner behind her. "You held the line," he said, something in his voice breaking open with a relief too large for words. "Damn right I did," Cassia said, voice shaking but certain. "Nobody touches my children." She heard the word as it left her mouth. "My children," and realized, standing there bruised and trembling in her own bathroom, that she hadn't meant just Trey. Outside, sirens began to wail down the block. Mrs. Alvarez had called it in the moment she saw the second car circle back. Devon had gotten a clear shot of the plates on his phone. Mr. Briggs had locked his store and directed 2 fleeing men straight into the path of a patrol car that Auntie May had summoned with a single, well-timed phone call. The block that nobody with money had ever bothered to protect had protected itself, and in doing so, protected the family huddled on its 3rd floor. The remaining attackers scattered into the night, realizing too late that they had never accounted for a neighborhood that watched out for its own. Later, once the ambulance had come and gone, once the boys had finally been coaxed back into an exhausted, tear-streaked sleep on the living room floor, Leo tugged at his father's sleeve. "Can we stay here forever?" he asked. Adrian's jaw tightened, the question landing somewhere deep and unguarded. "I don't know yet," he admitted, crouching down to his son's level. "But wherever we end up, I promise you, it will feel like this." Leo nodded like that was answer enough and curled back against Trey's shoulder, both boys finally still. Cassia, watching from the doorway with a bruise already darkening along her jaw, had to turn away before either of them saw her cry. It took weeks to unravel what came next, but Adrian didn't wait to start. "If somebody knows your patterns," Cassia told him one evening, watching him pace her small living room like a caged animal, "you change the pattern. That's the only thing that ever works, whether it's a man stalking your street or a bill collector who knows your schedule. You stop being predictable." Adrian looked at her like she'd handed him the missing piece of a puzzle he'd been failing to solve with far more sophisticated tools. He began feeding false information through the very channels Marcus had used to track him. Fake locations, fake timelines. A fake shipment route designed to draw both Marcus and Victor Rain into a trap of their own making. When the two men arrived with what remained of their loyal men, expecting to finish the job Marcus had started, they walked instead into a coordinated collapse. Federal investigators, tipped off weeks earlier with meticulously compiled shipment records, financial ledgers, and internal communications that Adrian had spent his career protecting, were waiting. Adrian did something he never imagined himself capable of. He handed over the entire architecture of the empire he'd spent 20 years building, choosing to burn it to the ground rather than let his son inherit a war disguised as a birthright. Marcus was arrested within the hour, abandoned by the very men he'd promised loyalty to in exchange for power. Victor Rain made it as far as the state line with a set of falsified documents and a bag of cash before being stopped, his ambitions ending in the back of an unmarked car. "You loved your son where men like us could see it," Marcus had spat at Adrian in the last conversation they ever had. "That was your mistake." It was Cassia, when Adrian recounted it to her later, who answered the accusation properly. "No," she said, "his mistake was thinking love makes people weaker. It's the only thing that's ever made anybody stronger." Months passed. Adrian spent them rebuilding, not an empire this time, but something legitimate. Logistics contracts. Legal holdings, long, tedious meetings with lawyers and investigators that bored him in a way gunfights never had, and that he was, for the first time in years, deeply grateful for. Cassia's apartment became something neither of them had planned for it to become. Sunday dinners turned into a ritual nobody questioned. Homework got done at her kitchen table under the same light that had once stitched a wound closed. Trey and Leo grew into something closer than classmates, closer than friends, into brothers, in every way that mattered, without either family ever having to say the word out loud. One evening, ordinary in every way, no rain, no blood, no sirens in the distance, there was a knock at Cassia's door. 3 knocks, steady this time, none of the uneven desperation of that first night. She opened it to find Adrian standing there, dry, unarmed, and for the first time since she'd met him, entirely at ease. "The first time I knocked on this door," he said, "I asked if my son could stay." Cassia waited, heart in her throat, already knowing what came next. "Today," Adrian said, "I'm asking if we both can." She didn't answer him with a speech. She didn't need to. She simply stepped back and opened the door wider. the way she had that very first rainy night, except this time there was nothing to be afraid of on the other side of it. He had built an empire to keep his son safe. But the first place his son ever truly called home was a third-floor apartment with 3 locks on the door, a cast-iron skillet in the kitchen, and a woman who opened the door when every sensible part of her knew she shouldn't, because somewhere out in the rain, a child needed somewhere safe to stand, and she had never once been the kind of person who could walk away from that. If this story moved you, that's the whole point of found family. It doesn't always look like blood. Sometimes it looks like a locked door that opens anyway, a neighborhood that shows up without being asked, and 2 people brave enough to let each other in. If you want more stories like this one, Mafia romance, protective fathers, women who are far stronger than anyone gives them credit for, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this family story isn't the last one we're going to tell.